Chad Timberton gained consciousness and all he could feel was an intense burning sensation all around his body. He tried to force his eyes open, but they just wouldn't open. It wasn't like they were glued shut, but he just couldn't force them to open. Chad rolled around in what felt like sand for a minute due to the intense burning sensation, but it slowly eased into just a headache. For a moment, Chad thought he was dead, but he was too stuck in his atheistic ideologies to entertain the thought any longer. Chad remembered Gus Blue and the predicament at the lab, but something told him that that day was long ago. Chad finally managed to open his eyes and was almost blinded by the hot sun that was beating on his bare chest. Other than being shirtless, Chad wore a pair of tan cargo pants and Nike sneakers. Chad stood up and looked around and just saw a desert landscape for as far as his eyes could see. At that moment, Chad felt a terrible fear culminate in his stomach. This place certainly was not California, and didn't even look like America. There were large holes scattered across the landscape, which immediately reminded Chad of the moon. Chad kept looking around and barely saw tents in the distance. He had no desire to go anywhere near the tents. Whoever had taken him to this place did not have his best interest at heart, and they also must have been where the tents were. Chad got over his panic and realized just how hot and dehydrated he was. He realized he couldn't stay where he was and survive. He knew he needed help, so he began walking to the tents. Along the way, he gazed at the holes, realizing that they looked more like mines with the wooden support beams and how they looked more like a tunnel than a hole. He also had blisters on his hands, which he didn't remember being there before. He tried to recall the events at the lab that could have led him to end up in this terrifying situation, but all he could remember was being held hostage by Johnny Wilson and then Gus was taken, too. Chad couldn't remember exactly what was said. Gus Blue could very well be dead, for all Chad knew. Chad reached the tents and saw that there were dozens of them, and there was a man sitting in a chair wearing a tank top and a hat and sunglasses. Timberton, the man, said. It didn't go well, huh? Came back without a pickaxe or your sack. Explain. Who are you? Chad asked. Pierre DuPont. I got here just today, the man replied. Mr. Fortworth left for a vacation last night while you were gone, so I'll be here for a week. Chad wondered why Ali's father was here, and what he meant when he said, it didn't go well. I need water, Chad said. You'll get water when you get your fucking pickaxe and bring me some diamonds, Pierre replied calmly yet spitefully. Chad was confused. He thought that Pierre might have been mistaking Chad for somebody else, but Pierre did call him Timberton. What happened? Chad asked. My daughter was right about you being a big dumb idiot. You lost your pickaxe is what fucking happened. Chad looked at Pierre DuPont's skinny physicality and saw that he was no match for Chad's football physique. He had thinned out a very noticeable amount, however. He then looked around for anyone who could help Pierre, but nobody could be seen. Chad jumped on top of Pierre and collapsed him and the chair to the ground. Pierre and Chad grunted as they wrestled for control over the current situation. Chad managed to grab both of Pierre's hands with just one of his hands, rendering them both useless as Chad punched Pierre in the face 3 times. Take me home, Chad shouted. It'll take some arrangements, Pierre pleaded. Get me a plane ticket, Chad ordered. There's a golf cart I'll drive you to an airport, Pierre said in agony. Chad let Pierre stand up and Pierre took himself and Chad to a golf cart. Pierre started driving with Chad in the golf cart, and they drove for about 20 minutes. Chad asked no more questions. He was only relieved that this nightmare he woke up to was seemingly coming to an end. The golf cart started driving next to a shallow ravine and Pierre became antsy. He started fidgeting with the wheel and his hat. Suddenly, Pierre swerved the cart into the ravine and jumped out of the cart as he did so, leaving Chad in the cart alone and flying into the ravine. The cart made impact with the wall of the ravine and Chad's nose slammed into the dashboard. The cart landed sideways and Chad landed on the rocky ground, his body scraping against it, leaving painful scrapes. Chad looked up and saw Pierre standing over the edge of the ravine, looking relatively unscathed. Pierre jumped down onto the hood of the cart and engaged in another fight with Chad. This time, Chad was nauseous from his broken nose and shaken from the crash and was easily defeated. Pierre took Chad back to the surface and walked with him for an hour to get back to the camp. When they returned, Chad was chained to a telephone pole and beaten. Chad watched many African men return to the camp holding their sacks and pickaxes. They stared at Chad with a look of pity. Chad was in immense pain but still confused as to what happened. All he could do was close his eyes and fall asleep. Chad awoke and felt a terrible burning sensation throughout his body. He couldn't open his eyes, and he had no clue where he was. For a minute, he thought he was in heaven, but he finally managed to open his eyes and realized that he was chained to a pole, and he had a broken nose with scrapes on his body. The burning sensation disappeared, but it changed into a different feeling burning on these injuries. Chad remembered Gus and the predicament at the lab, but Chad had a feeling deep down that he was days past that time. He now had his own situation to deal with. He was surrounded by tents at noon. In a desert, he saw several African men walking around the camp with sacks and pickaxes. Chad opened his mouth to say something, but all that came out was a hoarse moan. His throat was so dry that it felt like he hadn't had any water in days. One of the men came over to Chad and said something in a foreign language as he poured some water from his canteen into his mouth. Chad tried to thank him, but he couldn't manage to say the words, so only a hoarse moan came out again. The man smiled and walked away. Chad sat there and contemplated what was going on. He couldn't remember much of what happened in the lab, or who he saw, but he could remember Johnny Wilson attacking him and Gus Blue, and something must have gone horribly wrong for him to have ended up where he was. He started to panic. He thought about what his parents were thinking, about what his girlfriend, Melissa, was thinking. He just disappeared, and the new place he was in certainly didn't look like Benko Falls. After an hour of sitting and wondering, a man wearing a hat and sunglasses walked up to Chad and unchained him with a key. Chad didn't even try to say something. He knew he couldn't manage a single syllable anyway. "Get back to work," the man said. The man gave Chad a steel pickaxe, a sack, and a canteen filled with water and ordered him to walk west and start digging. Chad chugged all of his water immediately, which reminded him of his time on the varsity football team where he'd chug water from a Gatorade water bottle while he was on the bench. But now, there were no refills, and he was forced to dig in a mine for many hours straight without water. He didn't know why he was in this situation, but more importantly, he didn't know how to get out. He thought about walking further south and trying to escape the desert, but it seemed more likely to Chad that he'd die before he could ever escape. Chad felt that he desperately needed medical attention to his nose. It throbbed the whole time he worked and seemed to never get any better. As for his scrapes, dirt and rocks were finding their way onto the bloody layer of skin, and Chad feared it would get infected. At nightfall, which is the time that the man told Chad to come back to the camp, he did. He tried to talk to the man, but no words could come out of his dry throat. He was shown to his tent, which looked like it had already been slept in. There was an air mattress and a kilt blanket with a journal and a pencil sitting on the ground next to it. Chad laid in the bed and picked up the journal and saw that it was written in it a good amount. It was too dark to read, however, so Chad stepped out of the tent to read the writing under the moonlight. It read, June 5, 2023. You are Chad Timberton, and the person who is writing this is also Chad Timberton. Every time you fall asleep, you lose your memories. I don't know what happened in the lab, but now I'm in Madagascar mining for minerals every day. Fort Worth, the man who keeps me here, says I will stay here until the day I die. When you see this, do not panic, just keep reading whatever else you wrote and write down any new information. I'm not giving up hope. The past Chads, even when they didn't have any information to be written down, still wrote down the date to keep track of what day it was. June 11, 2023. Fort Worth likes it when I bring back copper. June 13, 2023. I miss my parents and Melissa. Do not forget them, ever. June 20, 2023. The other slaves don't speak English, but they're nice. Treat them well. As far as I know, Fort Worth still hasn't figured out about my memory. I have no idea if I should keep it hidden. I feel like I have no idea about anything. June 30, 2023. Pierre DuPont is coming to take over for Fort Worth tomorrow. To Chad, it felt like a bomb had just been dropped on him. From living a normal life as a 15-year-old boy who played football, to getting shot, to now finding himself in a living nightmare. Chad guessed that the man wearing the hat and sunglasses was Pierre DuPont. So he knew he had something to write. With Chad waking up chained to a pole, he had no idea how long he'd been there and didn't know what date to put in, but he took a guess and wrote, July 1st, 2023. I woke up chained to a pole. I don't know how. Pierre DuPont is here. Chad laid in bed for an hour, struggling with the idea of falling asleep. He knew that the next time he was awake, he wouldn't remember anything that had happened to him that day, but he took a leap of faith and closed his eyes.